The morning sun was just peeking through the clouds as passengers began boarding Flight 447 from Atlanta to Washington. It was going to be one of those busy travel days where everyone seemed to be in a hurry, rushing to get somewhere important. Amongst the travelers was Harold, a 78-year-old man who moved with the careful steps of someone who had lived through many years. He wore a simple dark suit that looked well-maintained but not expensive. In his weathered hands, he carried an old leather briefcase that had clearly seen better days. The case was worn at the corners and had small scratches that told stories of countless journeys. Harold made his way through the airport terminal slowly but steadily. He didn't rush like the younger passengers around him. There was something peaceful about the way he walked, as if he had learned long ago that hurrying rarely changed the important things in life. When it was time to board, Harold waited patiently in line. He had a coach seat, middle row, nothing fancy. He had his boarding pass ready and showed it to the gate agent with a quiet thank you and a gentle nod. The young woman at the gate smiled back, noticing his polite manner. As Harold walked down the narrow aisle of the airplane, he had to move carefully. The space was tight, and his aging joints didn't bend as easily as they once did. He checked his ticket again to make sure he was going to the right seat. Row 23, seat B. Middle seat, just as he expected. Behind him in the boarding line was Victoria, a well-dressed woman in her mid-40s. She was clearly a frequent traveler, the kind who knew all the tricks of air travel. Her designer purse was slung over her shoulder, and she tapped her manicured nails impatiently on her phone as she watched Harold's slow progress down the aisle. Victoria had been upgraded to first class because of her frequent flyer status. She was used to getting special treatment and expected things to move quickly and smoothly. Today, she had an important business meeting in Washington, and she was already thinking about the presentation she needed to give. As Harold reached his row, he carefully placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment. The movement took him a moment longer than it might take a younger person. He had to reach up slowly, making sure he had a good grip on the case before lifting it. Victoria found herself stuck behind him in the aisle, waiting to get to the bathroom before takeoff. She checked her expensive watch and sighed loudly, hoping Harold would hurry up. Harold settled into his middle seat, which meant he had to navigate around the passenger already seated by the window. The older gentleman by the window, named Frank, helped by standing up slightly to give Harold more room. "Thank you kindly," Harold said to Frank with a warm smile. "No problem at all," Frank replied, noticing something familiar about Harold's polite manner and the way he carried himself. As Harold adjusted his seatbelt and tried to make himself comfortable in the cramped space, he accidentally brushed against Victoria's designer purse as she tried to squeeze past him in the narrow aisle. That small contact was like lighting a match to dry wood. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks and turned to face Harold. Her voice was sharp and loud enough for several rows to hear clearly. "Excuse me, you need to watch what you're doing," she snapped, pulling her purse protectively against her body. "That's an expensive bag and you just grabbed it with your hands." Harold looked up at her with calm, tired eyes. There was no anger in his expression, just the patient look of someone who had dealt with difficult situations many times before. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," he said quietly. "I was just trying to get situated in my seat. I didn't mean to touch your bag." But Victoria wasn't finished. Her voice got even louder, and more passengers began to turn their heads to see what was happening. "Well, maybe you should think about whether you can handle traveling with other people before you get on a plane," she continued. "Some of us have important business to take care of, and we don't have time for this kind of thing." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few people pulled out their phones, not to make calls, but to potentially record what was happening. Harold's response was as gentle as before. "I understand you're in a hurry, ma'am. I'll be more careful." Frank, sitting by the window, leaned slightly toward Harold and whispered, "Don't let her bother you, friend. You're doing just fine." Victoria heard the whisper and turned her attention to Frank. "Excuse me, but this doesn't concern you. I'm just trying to make sure everyone understands that there are standards of behavior when you're traveling." A young man in military uniform sitting a few rows behind them stood up when he heard the conversation getting more heated. His name was Danny, and he was returning home after completing basic training. "Sir?" Danny called out to Harold. "Would you like to switch seats? I have an aisle seat back here." Harold turned around and gave Danny a grateful smile. "That's very kind of you, young man, but I'm perfectly fine where I am. Thank you for the offer, though." Victoria wasn't pleased that other passengers were getting involved. She felt like everyone was ganging up on her when she was just trying to make a point about proper behavior. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice rising even more. "Now we have people making a big scene and disrupting the whole flight before it even takes off." Linda, one of the flight attendants, noticed the commotion and walked over to see what was happening. She was an experienced crew member who had dealt with difficult passengers many times before. "Is everything okay here?" Linda asked in her professional, calm voice. Victoria immediately turned to her. "Yes, I'd like to file a complaint. This man," she pointed at Harold, "was careless with my personal belongings. And now there's all this disruption. I think he should be moved to a different section of the plane." Linda looked at Harold, who was sitting quietly with his hands folded in his lap. She had been watching the situation from the galley and had seen that Harold hadn't done anything wrong. "Sir, are you comfortable in your current seat?" Linda asked Harold directly. "Yes, ma'am, I'm perfectly fine," Harold replied. "I apologize if there was any confusion." Victoria wasn't satisfied with this response. "I have platinum status with this airline," she announced loudly. "I've been flying with you for over 10 years, and I expect a certain level of service. This kind of disruption is exactly why I usually upgrade to first class." Several passengers were now openly staring at the situation. Some looked embarrassed for Victoria, others seemed annoyed by her behavior. A middle-aged woman named Betty sitting across the aisle shook her head in disapproval. "Ma'am," Linda said to Victoria, "I understand you're concerned, but I don't see any reason to move anyone. Everyone seems to be in their assigned seats." Harold spoke up quietly. "If it would make the lady more comfortable, I'm happy to move wherever you think is best." There was something in the way Harold said those words that made Frank look at him more carefully. Frank was a veteran himself, having served in Korea many years ago, and he recognized something in Harold's posture and manner of speaking. "Were you in the military, son?" Frank asked Harold directly. Harold nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. A long time ago." Frank's expression changed immediately. He had developed an eye for spotting fellow veterans over the years, and now he was certain about. Victoria overheard this exchange and rolled her eyes. "Well, that's nice, but it doesn't give anyone special treatment or an excuse for poor behavior. We all have our stories and our backgrounds." The way she said it made several passengers uncomfortable. Danny, the young soldier, clenched his jaw, but remained quiet. Betty across the aisle muttered something under her breath about respect. Harold didn't respond to Victoria's comment. Instead, he carefully adjusted his briefcase at his feet and pulled out a newspaper from the seat pocket. His movements were deliberate and calm, as if he had learned long ago not to let other people's words affect his peace of mind. Frank continued to study Harold, noticing small details that others might miss. There was something about the way Harold sat, the way he held his shoulders, that spoke of military training. And there was a small pin on Harold's jacket lapel that Frank couldn't quite make out from his angle. Linda finished trying to calm the situation and returned to her duties, but she kept an eye on the area to make sure nothing else developed. Victoria finally made her way to the bathroom, still muttering about inconsiderate passengers and declining standards of air travel. As the plane prepared for departure, Harold sat quietly reading his newspaper. He seemed completely unaffected by what had just happened, as if he had developed a thick skin over many years of dealing with difficult people and situations. Frank wanted to ask Harold more about his military service, but he didn't want to pry. There was something about Harold's quiet dignity that commanded respect, and Frank sensed that there might be more to this elderly gentleman than met the eye. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and passengers started settling in for the journey to Washington. Victoria had returned to her first-class seat, occasionally glancing back toward Harold's section with a disapproving expression. But Harold remained peaceful, occasionally glancing at his worn briefcase with a look that suggested it contained something very important to him. Whatever was in that case seemed to give him strength and comfort, especially after the unpleasant encounter with Victoria. Little did anyone on that flight know that they were about to witness something that would change their perspective on judging people by their appearance, and that Harold's quiet dignity was about to be revealed in a way that would leave everyone speechless. As the airplane engines started their familiar rumble, the tension from the earlier incident still hung in the air like morning fog. Victoria had settled into her first-class seat, but she couldn't shake off her frustration. She kept glancing back toward the coach section where Harold sat quietly reading his newspaper. The other passengers were settling in for the flight, but many of them were still talking in hushed voices about what they had just witnessed. Some felt uncomfortable about Victoria's behavior, while others weren't quite sure what to think about the whole situation. Danny, the young soldier who had offered his seat to Harold, couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man's calm response to Victoria's harsh words. There was something about Harold that reminded Danny of his own grandfather, who had also served in the military many years ago. His grandfather had that same quiet strength, that same way of staying peaceful even when others were being difficult. Betty, the middle-aged woman sitting across the aisle from Harold, kept stealing glances at him. She had raised 3 sons and had learned to read people pretty well over the years. Something about Harold's gentle manner and patient response told her that this was a man who had seen much more in life than most people could imagine. Frank, sitting by the window next to Harold, was becoming more and more curious about his seatmate. As a Korean War veteran himself, Frank had developed a sixth sense about fellow service members. The way Harold carried himself, the way he spoke with quiet respect, and especially that small pin on his jacket lapel, all pointed to military service. "Mind if I ask what branch you served in?" Frank whispered to Harold as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Harold looked up from his newspaper and smiled gently. "Army, sir. Spent some time in Vietnam back in the day." Frank nodded with understanding. "I figured as much. I was in Korea myself. Different war, same kind of service to country." "Thank you for your service," Harold said simply, extending his hand to Frank. As they shook hands, Frank noticed something else about Harold. His grip was still firm despite his age, and there were small scars on his hands that spoke of hard times and difficult experiences. Meanwhile, Victoria was getting more agitated in her first-class seat. The flight attendant had offered her champagne and warm nuts, but she was still thinking about the incident with Harold. In her mind, she felt justified in speaking up about what she saw as inconsiderate behavior. She pulled out her phone and started typing a message to her assistant. "Delayed departure due to inconsiderate passenger. Some people just don't understand proper travel etiquette," she wrote. But before sending the message, she paused and looked back toward Harold's section again. Linda, the experienced flight attendant, was making her rounds through the cabin, checking on passengers and making sure everyone was comfortable for takeoff. When she reached Harold's row, she noticed that he seemed completely at peace, as if the earlier confrontation hadn't bothered him at all. "Can I get you anything before we take off, sir?" Linda asked Harold. "No, thank you, ma'am. I'm doing just fine," Harold replied with a warm smile. Linda had been working flights for over 15 years, and she had developed a good sense about people. There was something special about Harold that she couldn't quite put her finger on. He had the kind of presence that made people feel calm and safe, even in the middle of an uncomfortable situation. As Linda continued down the aisle, she overheard 2 passengers talking about the incident with Victoria. "I can't believe that woman spoke to that nice old man like that," one passenger whispered to another. "I know. He seemed so polite and patient. Some people just don't have any manners anymore," the other replied. Danny, the young soldier, was still bothered by what had happened. He had been taught in basic training to respect his elders, especially those who had served before him. He couldn't understand how anyone could be so rude to someone like Harold, who clearly deserved better treatment. During a quiet moment, Danny got up from his seat and walked over to Harold's row. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service, and I'm sorry about what happened earlier." Harold looked up at Danny with kind eyes. Thank you, young man. But there's no need to apologize for someone else's actions. We can only control our own behavior, not other people's. Danny was impressed by Harold's wisdom and grace. If you don't mind me asking, sir, what unit were you with in Vietnam? Harold's expression became thoughtful for a moment. I was with the 1st Infantry Division. We called ourselves the Big Red One. Frank overheard this and turned toward Harold with renewed interest. The 1st Infantry Division had a reputation as one of the most decorated units in Vietnam. If Harold had served with them, he had likely seen serious combat. The Big Red One had quite a reputation, Frank said quietly. Must have been tough over there. Harold nodded slowly. It was a different time, and we all did what we had to do. A lot of good men didn't make it home. There was something in the way Harold said those words that made both Frank and Danny realize they were talking to someone who had experienced things that most people couldn't imagine. The quiet sadness in his voice spoke of losses and sacrifices that went far beyond what most civilians could understand. Victoria, from her first-class seat, noticed Danny talking to Harold and felt even more annoyed. In her mind, the young soldier was just encouraging what she saw as attention-seeking behavior from Harold. She called the flight attendant over. "Excuse me, but is that soldier bothering the other passengers? I thought we had resolved this situation already." Linda looked back toward Harold's section and saw Danny having a quiet, respectful conversation with Harold and Frank. "I don't see any problem, ma'am. They're just talking quietly." "Well, I still think this whole situation was handled poorly," Victoria continued. "I pay good money to fly with this airline, and I expect a certain level of order and decorum." Linda remained professional. "I understand your concerns, ma'am, but everyone seems to be behaving appropriately now." Back in coach, Harold was carefully adjusting his briefcase at his feet. Frank noticed how gently Harold handled the old leather case, as if it contained something very precious and important. "That's a well-traveled briefcase," Frank observed. Harold smiled and patted the case gently. "It's been with me for a long time. Carries some important memories." Frank didn't want to pry, but he was becoming more and more curious about Harold's story. The combination of his military service, his quiet dignity, and the careful way he treated that old briefcase suggested that there was much more to this elderly gentleman than anyone on the plane realized. Danny returned to his seat, but he kept thinking about his conversation with Harold. There was something about the way Harold had spoken about his service that suggested he had done more than just serve his time and come home. The young soldier had learned enough about military history to know that the 1st Infantry Division had been involved in some of the heaviest fighting in Vietnam. As the plane finally took off, Harold gazed out the window at the ground falling away below. His thoughts seemed to drift to another time and place, and Frank noticed a distant look in Harold's eyes that he recognized from his own memories of war. Betty, sitting across the aisle, had been watching the interactions around Harold with growing respect for the elderly man. She had seen how gracefully he had handled Victoria's rudeness, how kindly he had spoken to the young soldier, and how patiently he had dealt with the whole uncomfortable situation. The flight was now at cruising altitude, and the passengers were settling in for the journey to Washington. Victoria had ordered another drink and was trying to focus on her business presentation, but she kept finding her attention drawn back to the coach section, where Harold sat quietly. Something was bothering her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way the other passengers had rallied around Harold, or maybe it was the respectful way the young soldier had spoken to him. Whatever it was, Victoria was starting to feel less certain about her earlier behavior. Harold, meanwhile, continued to read his newspaper peacefully. Occasionally he would glance at his briefcase or look out the window with that same distant expression. Frank had given up trying to figure out what was special about Harold, and had decided to just enjoy the company of a fellow veteran. But unknown to all the passengers, including Harold himself, there was information about their flight that would soon change everything. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was going through his pre-flight paperwork and passenger manifests, a routine he followed on every flight. As he flipped through the pages, his eyes fell on a special notation that he had somehow missed during his initial review. It was a small note attached to one passenger's information. The kind of note that airlines sometimes include for VIP travelers or passengers with special circumstances. Captain Mitchell's eyes widened as he read the details. More carefully, he read the information once, then twice, then a third time to make sure he wasn't making a mistake. The notation was about Harold Washington, the quiet elderly man sitting in seat 23B, the same man who had just been involved in an incident with another passenger. What Captain Mitchell was reading was about to turn this ordinary flight into something that none of the passengers would ever forget. Captain Mitchell sat in the cockpit, staring at the passenger manifest in complete disbelief. His hands were actually shaking as he read the special notation attached to Harold Washington's name for the third time. The information was so incredible that he had to make sure he wasn't reading it wrong. The notation read, Harold Washington, Medal of Honor recipient, Vietnam War, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device, retired Colonel, U.S. Army, special recognition requested by Veterans Affairs. Captain Mitchell had been flying commercial airlines for over 20 years and he had never seen anything like this. He had transported many veterans over the years, but never someone with decorations like these. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration in the United States, given only to those who had shown extraordinary courage in combat. His mind raced as he tried to process what this meant. The quiet elderly man sitting in coach, the same man who had just been treated rudely by another passenger, was one of America's greatest war heroes. Captain Mitchell felt a mix of emotions, excitement, honor, and honestly a little bit of shame, that such a distinguished person was sitting in a middle seat in coach, while others who had done far less for their country were comfortable in first class. Captain Mitchell turned to his co-pilot, Robert, who was running through the flight checklist. "Robert, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice filled with amazement. "What's up, Captain?" Robert asked, looking up from his instruments. "We have a Medal of Honor recipient on board, a real-life war hero sitting back there in coach." Robert's eyes widened. "Are you serious? Who is it?" Captain Mitchell showed him the manifest. Harold Washington, seat 23B, Vietnam veteran, Medal of Honor, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, the whole package. Robert whistled softly. "And he's just sitting back there like any other passenger?" "That's exactly what he's doing," Captain Mitchell replied. "From what I can see in these notes, he was involved in some kind of rescue operation in Vietnam that saved dozens of lives. He held off enemy forces while wounded, allowing other soldiers to escape." The two pilots sat in silence for a moment, both thinking about the incredible coincidence of having such a distinguished veteran on their flight. Captain Mitchell had grown up in a military family. His father had served in World War II and his brother was currently stationed overseas. He had deep respect for military service and understood the significance of the decorations Harold had earned. Meanwhile, back in the passenger cabin, Harold was still reading his newspaper quietly. He had no idea that his military record had been discovered or that it was about to change everything about this flight. Frank, sitting next to Harold, was becoming more and more convinced that there was something special about his seatmate. The more they talked, the more Frank realized that Harold's stories from Vietnam weren't just typical war stories. They were accounts of someone who had been in the thick of some serious combat. "Harold," Frank said quietly, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you sound like you saw some heavy action over there." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "We all did our part, Frank. Some missions were tougher than others." Frank had been in combat himself in Korea, and he recognized the way Harold talked about his service. It was the way someone spoke when they had been through experiences that most people couldn't understand. There was no boasting, no exaggeration, just quiet acknowledgement of difficult times. Danny, the young soldier, had returned to his seat but couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Harold. Something about the older man's humble way of talking about his service reminded Danny of stories he had heard about real heroes, the kind of people who did extraordinary things but never bragged about them. During his basic training, Danny had learned about the Medal of Honor and the kind of courage it represented. He had studied stories of Medal of Honor recipients, and he remembered that many of them were humble people who insisted they had just done their job, even though they had risked everything to save others. Victoria, meanwhile, was trying to focus on her business presentation, but she kept feeling uncomfortable about the earlier incident. She had noticed how respectfully the young soldier had spoken to Harold, and how other passengers seemed to hold the elderly man in high regard. Something was nagging at her, making her question whether she had misjudged the situation. She called the flight attendant over again. "Excuse me, do you know anything about that man in coach, the one from earlier?" Linda looked puzzled. "Which passenger are you referring to, ma'am?" "The elderly man in row 23. Harold, I think his name was." Linda shook her head. "I don't have any special information about him. He seems like a very polite gentleman. Is there something specific you need to know?" Victoria couldn't explain why she was asking. She just had a feeling that she was missing something important about Harold, something that would make her earlier behavior seem even worse than it already did. Back in the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was still processing the information about Harold. He had made a decision that he knew was unusual, but he felt it was the right thing to do. He was going to personally go back and meet Harold Washington. "Robert," he said to his co-pilot, "I'm going to go back and introduce myself to Colonel Washington." Robert looked concerned. "Are you sure that's a good idea? We're in the middle of a flight." "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," Captain Mitchell replied. "How often do you get to meet a Medal of Honor recipient? Besides, I think he deserves to know that his service is recognized and appreciated." Captain Mitchell stood up from his seat and straightened his uniform. He had never done anything like this before, but he felt compelled to honor Harold's service in some way. As he walked from the cockpit toward the passenger cabin, Captain Mitchell's mind was racing. He was trying to think of the right words to say to someone who had risked his life to save others. How do you thank someone for that kind of sacrifice? The passengers in first class looked up in surprise as Captain Mitchell walked through their section. It was unusual for the captain to leave the cockpit during flight, and several people wondered if something was wrong. Victoria noticed the captain walking through first class and assumed he was coming to speak with her about her earlier complaint. She straightened up in her seat, preparing to discuss the incident with Harold. But Captain Mitchell walked right past Victoria without stopping. He continued toward the coach section, his expression serious and determined. Several passengers turned to watch him, wondering what was happening. Harold was still reading his newspaper when Captain Mitchell approached row 23. Frank noticed the captain coming and wondered what was going on. Danny, sitting a few rows back, also saw the captain approaching Harold's section. Captain Mitchell stopped directly in front of Harold's seat. The elderly man looked up from his newspaper with a polite, questioning expression. "Excuse me, sir," Captain Mitchell said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Are you Harold Washington?" Harold nodded, looking a bit confused. "Yes, I am. Is there something wrong, Captain?" Captain Mitchell's next words were spoken, loud enough for several rows of passengers to hear clearly. "Sir, are you Colonel Harold Washington, United States Army?" Harold's expression changed slightly. He seemed surprised that the captain knew about his military rank. "Well, yes, I was a colonel, but that was a long time ago." The captain's voice grew stronger and more formal. "Colonel Washington, according to my passenger manifest, you are a recipient of the Medal of Honor, the Purple Heart, and the Bronze Star with V device for valor in combat. Is that correct, sir?" The effect of these words on the surrounding passengers was immediate and dramatic. Frank's mouth dropped open in amazement. Danny shot up straighter in his seat, suddenly understanding why Harold had seemed so special. Betty, sitting across the aisle, gasped audibly. Harold looked uncomfortable with the attention but nodded quietly. "Yes, sir, that's correct." Captain Mitchell's voice became even more respectful. "Colonel Washington, could you tell me about the action that earned you the Medal of Honor?" Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He clearly didn't like being the center of attention, but he answered the captain's question with quiet dignity. "It was during a rescue operation in 1968, Harold said simply. "My unit was trying to extract some wounded soldiers who were trapped behind enemy lines. We came under heavy fire, and I was able to hold off the enemy forces long enough for the helicopters to get our people out." Captain Mitchell nodded, but he had read more details in the manifest notes. Colonel, according to this information, you were wounded in that action but continued fighting for over 6 hours, allowing 47 soldiers to be rescued. You single-handedly held off an entire enemy company. The cabin had become completely silent. Every passenger within hearing distance was listening to this incredible conversation. Harold's simple, humble account of his heroic actions was making everyone realize that they were in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. Frank grabbed Harold's arm gently. "Harold, you never told me you were a Medal of Honor recipient." Harold smiled at his seatmate. "You never asked, Frank. Besides, it's not something I usually bring up in casual conversation." Victoria, sitting in first class, could hear parts of the conversation, and she was beginning to understand that something very significant was happening. The pieces were starting to come together in her mind, and she was beginning to realize the magnitude of her earlier mistake. The moment Captain Mitchell learned the full details of Harold's heroic actions, something powerful stirred in his heart. Standing there in the narrow airplane aisle, looking down at this humble man who had saved 47 lives while wounded and under enemy fire, the captain felt overwhelmed with respect and gratitude. Without hesitation, Captain Mitchell straightened his posture and brought his right hand up in a crisp, formal military salute. His voice rang out clearly through the cabin as he said, "Colonel Harold Washington, it is my absolute honor and privilege to have you aboard my aircraft today." The effect was immediate and breathtaking. Harold looked up at the captain with surprise and deep emotion in his eyes. Slowly, despite his age and the cramped airplane seat, Harold began to rise to return the salute. Frank quickly stood up to give Harold room, and as Harold got to his feet, every person who could see what was happening fell completely silent. The elderly war hero stood as straight as his aging body would allow and returned Captain Mitchell's salute with the dignity and precision of a true soldier. "Thank you, Captain," Harold said quietly, his voice carrying decades of memories and emotions. Danny, the young soldier sitting a few rows back, immediately shot to his feet and snapped to attention. His training kicked in automatically when he realized he was in the presence of a Medal of Honor recipient. With tears forming in his eyes, Danny rendered his own sharp salute to Harold. "Sir, it's an honor to serve in the same military that you helped make great," Danny called out, his young voice cracking with emotion. Harold turned toward Danny and nodded with a gentle smile. "The honor is mine, son. Thank you for your service." Frank, the Korean War veteran sitting next to Harold, slowly stood up and brought his hand to his forehead in his own salute. Though it had been many years since Frank had worn a uniform, his salute was respectful and heartfelt. From one veteran to another, Frank said, "Thank you for showing us all what real courage looks like." One by one, other passengers began to stand. Some were veterans themselves, others were family members of military personnel, and many were simply Americans who understood the significance of what they were witnessing. An elderly woman named Dorothy, sitting 3 rows behind Harold, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "My husband served in Vietnam," she called out. "He would have been so proud to meet you." A middle-aged man named Robert, traveling with his teenage son, pulled the boy to his feet. "Son," he whispered, "you're looking at a real American hero. Remember this moment." The wave of respect and recognition spread throughout the entire coach section of the airplane. Passengers were standing, some saluting, others simply placing their hands over their hearts. Many people were wiping away tears as they realized they were witnessing something truly special. Captain Mitchell remained at attention for a long moment, then slowly lowered his salute. "Colonel Washington," he said, "would you allow me the privilege of making an announcement to all the passengers about your service?" Harold looked uncomfortable with the attention, but he nodded quietly. "If you think it's appropriate, Captain." Captain Mitchell walked to the front of the coach section where more passengers could see him. He picked up the intercom phone and his voice filled the entire airplane. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell speaking. Before we continue our flight to Washington, I want to share something very special with all of you. We have aboard our aircraft today a true American hero." The entire plane became silent. Even the passengers in first class, including Victoria, turned their attention to the captain's words. "Colonel Harold Washington is sitting with us in seat 23B. Colonel Washington is a recipient of our nation's highest military honor, the Medal of Honor, which he earned during the Vietnam War. In 1968, while wounded and under heavy enemy fire, Colonel Washington single-handedly held off an entire enemy company for over 6 hours, allowing 47 American soldiers to be rescued and brought home safely. Gasps and murmurs of amazement rippled through the cabin. Victoria felt her stomach drop as she realized the full weight of her earlier behavior toward this incredible man. Captain Mitchell continued, Colonel Washington also received the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat and the Bronze Star, with V device for exceptional valor in the face of the enemy. On behalf of this crew and every passenger on this flight, I want to say thank you, Colonel Washington, for your service and sacrifice to our country. The applause that followed was unlike anything anyone on that plane had ever experienced. It started slowly, with a few people clapping, but quickly built into thunderous, sustained applause that lasted for several minutes. Passengers were standing, clapping, cheering, and many were crying openly. Harold stood quietly, clearly moved by the response, but also clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. He waved gently to acknowledge the applause, but his humble nature was evident in every gesture. During the applause, something remarkable happened. Passengers began moving toward Harold's section of the plane. They formed an orderly line, wanting to shake his hand and thank him personally. Young mother named Patricia approached with her 7-year-old daughter. Colonel Washington, she said, I wanted my daughter to meet you. Honey, this is a real hero. The little girl looked up at Harold with wide eyes. Thank you for keeping us safe, she said in her small voice. Harold knelt down to the child's level, his eyes soft with kindness. You're very welcome, sweetheart. You make sure you work hard in school and always be kind to others, okay? An elderly gentleman who identified himself as a Vietnam veteran approached Harold with tears in his eyes. Colonel, I served in the 25th Infantry Division. I never got the chance to thank the men who made it possible for guys like me to come home. Thank you, sir. Harold grasped the man's hand firmly. We all did our part, brother. Welcome home. During all of this, Victoria sat frozen in her first-class seat. The full reality of her behavior toward Harold was crashing down on her like a heavy weight. She had been rude and dismissive to a man who had risked his life to save others, a man who had earned the highest honor his country could give. The flight attendant, Linda, approached Victoria's seat. Ma'am, are you all right? You look upset. Victoria's eyes were filled with tears of shame and regret. I was horrible to him, she whispered. I was so rude to that wonderful man, and I had no idea who he was. Linda's expression softened with understanding. Would you like to go speak with him? I'm sure he would appreciate an apology. Victoria nodded, unable to speak. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up on shaking legs. The walk from first class to Harold's seat felt like the longest walk of her life. When Victoria reached row 23, Harold was sitting back down, still receiving thanks from other passengers. She waited patiently until there was a break in the line of people wanting to meet him. Colonel Washington, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold looked up at her with the same gentle expression he had maintained throughout their earlier encounter. There was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, just patience and kindness. Yes, ma'am, Harold replied politely. Victoria's voice broke as she spoke. Colonel Washington, I owe you the deepest apology. My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I was rude and disrespectful to you, and I am truly ashamed of myself. Harold stood up slowly and looked directly into Victoria's eyes. Ma'am, we all have moments we're not proud of. What matters is what we do next. But you didn't deserve to be treated that way, Victoria continued, tears flowing freely now. You're a hero, and I was awful to you. Harold gently placed his hand on Victoria's shoulder. I didn't serve my country to be treated differently than anyone else. I served because it was the right thing to do, and forgiveness is also the right thing to do. Victoria was overcome with emotion. How can you be so kind to me after how I acted? Harold smiled warmly. Because that's what my fellow soldiers died for. So people could learn and grow and become better. If I can help you become a better person today, then their sacrifice continues to mean something. Victoria reached out and took Harold's weathered hands in hers. Colonel Washington, you have taught me something today that I will never forget. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your forgiveness. As the plane began its descent into Washington, Captain Mitchell made one final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Washington, D.C. Colonel Washington, I understand you're visiting the Vietnam Veterans Memorial today. It would be my honor to arrange for you to be the first passenger off this aircraft. Harold spoke into the intercom that Captain Mitchell offered him. Thank you all for your kindness today, but I want you to know that I'm just one of many men and women who served. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come home. Please remember them too. As the plane landed and taxied to the gate, something extraordinary happened. The ground crew, who had been told about Harold's presence on the flight, had arranged a special welcome. When the airplane door opened, there was an honor guard of airport security officers and Veterans Organization members waiting to escort Harold through the terminal. Victoria insisted on helping Harold with his briefcase as they prepared to leave the plane. Colonel Washington, she said, would it be all right if I donated to the Veterans Memorial in your honor? Harold smiled. That would be very kind of you, ma'am, but make the donation in honor of all veterans, not just me. As Harold walked off the plane, every single passenger and crew member stood up and applauded. Captain Mitchell saluted one final time as Harold passed the cockpit door. The young soldier Danny approached Harold one last time before leaving the plane. Sir, meeting you today has changed my life. I'll never forget your example of humility and service. Harold shook Danny's hand firmly. Son, just remember that real strength comes from helping others, not from seeking recognition for yourself. As Harold disappeared into the terminal, surrounded by the honor guard, every person on that flight knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. They had seen how dignity and respect could triumph over prejudice, how true heroism often walks quietly among us, and how one person's courage could inspire an entire airplane full of strangers to become better people. Victoria kept her promise and made a substantial donation to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that very day. She also changed how she treated people, especially those who might seem different from her. The lesson Harold taught her about judging others continued to influence her behavior for the rest of her life. And Harold continued his quiet journey to honor his fallen comrades, carrying in his worn briefcase the letters and photos of the 47 men whose lives he had saved so many years ago, never seeking recognition for himself, but always remembering those who had given everything for their country.